Welcome to this special episode of The Journey Home. We're here in England, situated in the library here in Littlemore, just outside of Oxford. In fact, we just returned a bit ago from a walking tour of Oxford, went to some good used bookstores and visited some Catholic sites in Oxford. And I'm here interviewing Walter Hooper. He's going to talk to us about his journey of faith, and particularly his journey of faith into the Catholic Church. You may know of Walter Hooper. He was the personal secretary of C.S. Lewis with the last years of his life. Is that right, Walter?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, we'll talk more about that in a bit. So we're going to focus most of this program on Walter's spiritual journey, but how could we not talk a little bit about C.S. Lewis, who not only had, I'm sure, an influence in Walter's spiritual journey, but all of us, because of had been influenced by his writings. Mere Christianity, particularly, so many of us. And for me, I loved his book, Four Loves, as well as Screwtape Letters. So there's so many wonderful books that he wrote. So thank you for joining us in this special episode. Walter, welcome to the Journey Home program.
Thank you.
In fact, it's good to see you again.
Yes, mm-hmm.
You were, I think the first time we met was at Steubenville, Defending the Faith.
Yes.
A number of years ago. Were you there speaking on a C.S. Lewis topic, I presume?
Yes, I was surprised and delighted to be asked to come to defend Lewis as one of the modern defenders of the faith. And I was so pleased that my fellow Catholics liked him because, anyway, for various reasons, I was worried that I might find myself in a church that didn't honor a man I like so much.
Would C.S. Lewis have considered himself an apologist, per se?
Yes, he did. He was an apologist. I don't think he intended that at the beginning. Lewis was originally asked to write 4 talks to give over the BBC. This is 1941, the beginning of the war. They were so successful, he was asked to give a 2nd series, 3rd series, 4th series. And these series of broadcasts were later brought together as Mere Christianity. And he could hardly have known it at the time, but he was writing what I think many Catholics have called a great Catholic classic.
And probably it's good for us to know that background to that book when we are critical for what isn't there and recognize how it started and how it came together. It wasn't written from the beginning to be the compendium of all that one must believe in Christianity. But it was dealing with, and here we are during the war, isn't it right? I mean, a difficult time, encouraging people's faith. But as I said, we're here to hear your story. And I wondered if I could invite you to fill us in your spiritual background, your early days before you were drawn to the Catholic Church.
Well, I think all along, Lewis has played a part in it, and I'll explain how, if I may. When in 1953, various friends that I knew at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill were talking about this wonderful man, C.S. Lewis, but I hadn't had a chance to read any of his things, though I'd heard of the Screwtape Letters. Anyway, I was really on the verge, I think, of really making a commitment for Christ at that time, and Lewis had a part to play in that. I read Letters to Young Churches by J.B. Phillips, which had an introduction by Lewis. And what Lewis did, it was not so much what he said as the way he said it. And I thought, I would say now, he spoke with the certainty of the apostles. Anyway, right after that, I was friends of the members of the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Anyway, I remember where I was standing and exactly where the psalm was overhead when I suddenly saw all of this is real, that Jesus was who he said he was, Anyway, right after that, I had to go, like most men of my generation, into the army, the American Army. And I was at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, when the chaplain told me that Bob Jones Jr. was coming to town. And that what made him very interesting to me is he's the only man I'd heard of who had met C.S. Lewis. And anyway, they said, we're going to let you look after Dr. Jones because we know what you want to ask him. Anyways, I did, once we were alone, ask him if he what he thought of Lewis. And he said, well, you know, that man smokes a pipe and he drinks his pint of ale, but I do believe he is a Christian. Anyway, that inspired me to write to Lewis, which is something I wanted to do simply to express my gratitude for his books, by which time I had read 4 or 5. Anyway, he replied by return of post, which I thought surprising until I realized that he did this with everybody. Anyway, we corresponded for a number of years until in 1963 I was teaching at the University of Kentucky, and I had a chance to visit him. At least he invited me over here to Oxford to visit him. And I don't today even know what that meant for a single cup of tea or for more. Anyway, I came over and I went up to his house to see if I wanted to find the house before I actually had my meeting with him. Anyway, I found him and we met, and he was beyond anything that I had hoped. He sounded like his books. There was no difference, I think, between the man and this voice which I'd been listening to for all those years. But over the years, though, the journey of faith had been really one which had been partly mapped out by Lewis. And I had read Mere Christianity. I've read it many times, and I still read it with astonishment that he can take something like the resurrection and make it so clear. I remember reading that in the army and thinking, so that's what this doctrine means, that's what this means, you know.
Now, before you came to England,
Yes.
and became involved with the Anglican
Yes.
Church, were you Anglican in the United States?
I
or?
was.
Oh, you
yeah,
were?
yeah,
Oh, okay.
Yes.
All right, so you've always had, were you an active Anglican as a young man, or would that just come later when you were in college?
Well, I was more active in college.
All right.
Yes, and we had a very good chaplain in the University of North Carolina, and he inspired us all to read a great deal, and so we'd know the faith.
And you were greatly influenced by all those great InterVarsity books.
I was, and we had a number of conferences right outside Chapel Hill. But I had many good friends. I was very fortunate in the friends I've had. But it was Lewis who was my mentor. And I don't say, I think with most of the people I met, who were Catholics, in fact, who know Lewis has somehow, he's led them right up to the Catholic faith. And then, of course, you have to make your own decision, you know. But he has played probably the largest part in my becoming a Catholic than any Catholic has, you know. But, you know, God does a lot of weird things.
Oh, I know. That's right. His grace can use anything,
Yes,
really.
yes.
But he chose, in this case, a very good vessel of
Yes,
our Lord's love
yes,
in C.S. Lewis. Did C.S. Lewis have any influence in your eventual decision to go into the Anglican ministry?
He did, in a way. I felt that I should sort of concentrate more on the faith. And also, it's something I've never said before, but I wanted to be able to say a mass for his soul, because when he died, my first action was to pray to him. I don't say that I can defend that action. I'm just simply saying, this is what happened. I prayed to him. I loved him so much, and I didn't want him to forget me, you know. So I realized later, this is a perfectly good thing to do. But as an Anglican, I wasn't sure it was quite allowed.
Because the Anglicans have a bit different understanding of community of saints than we Catholics.
Well, Lewis himself believed in the community of saints, and he prayed. He said, how could you not pray for all of those who have died, whom you've loved? Because there might come a time, you see, when you get old, when most of those that you love have died. How odd if Christ forbade you to pray for those you love the most. Anyway, I found that so many of the things which my reasons for becoming an Anglican clergyman really were inspired by, as I look back now, by a really Catholic understanding of the Church of England and the prayer book.
Was how long after the death? See, well, let's say first of all, you were working in those last years of C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
Talk a bit. I don't think we mentioned here your relationship with C.S. Lewis, and then right after his death.
Well, I was with him only a short while. I met him on the 7th of June, 1963, and I was. I thought this was just it, that he invited me in and we had tea. It was simply wonderful. I remember it as though it were yesterday. But anyway, I thought it was the end when he took me to the pub. That's where the bus was. So when we said goodbye, I thought, well, this was really it. So I said, well, thank you very much for your time. He said, you're not getting away. You're coming to the Inkling meeting on Monday. And this is when, I met his friends. But after that...
The friends being, tell our audience, they may not all know who his friends were.
Well, at that time, Christopher Tolkien, I remember, was there. And members of the Inklings, not J.R.R. Tolkien, who wasn't going to those meetings at that time, but Colin Hardy and various others.
Right.
Anyway, Lewis then invited me to his house about 3 times a week, and we went to church together. And then after a month, I realized he was an ill man, and he was thinking of having to retire from his job in Cambridge, where he was a professor. And so he asked if I would stay in Oxford as his private secretary, and he asked me if I would move in to his house then. I did, but it was with the understanding that I would go back to Kentucky. I was teaching at the University of Kentucky in Lexington and teach one final term and then come back here in January of 1964 to resume my job with Lewis. So we had the summer together, but then at the end of the summer I went back to teach one final term. And then, maybe you were old enough to remember this terrible day in 1963, 22nd of November. A colleague told me on the way to a lecture that he'd heard that President Kennedy had been shot. And we lived all day with that dreadful knowledge that he had died. And I just got into bed that evening when Douglas Gresham rang, the stepson of C.S. Lewis, to say that C.S. Lewis had died, same hour that President Kennedy had died. Anyway, I was persuaded by his friends to come back to Oxford, and his brother, Warney, asked me to edit his literal remains. So this is what I'm still doing.
That's your life work now.
Yes.
That's right. Well, it seemed like that would be enough to keep you busy, is just not only editing that, but enjoying the intimate writings of C.S. Lewis.
Yes,
But the Lord was calling you even into the ministry itself. So how long after his death then did you continue with this and then decide to go into the ministry?
One of his close friends, Dr. Austin Farrer, who at that time was the warden of Keble, he felt I should be ordained, and he rather pushed this. And I was ordained really with the idea of being being sort of what they would call a massing priest, not stopping the Lewis work, continuing, but having the two running side by side. But my first job, though, as an Anglican clergyman, was as the chaplain of Wadham College. There are 37 colleges, so your readers and viewers will hardly realize how complicated
37 colleges just here in Oxford, right?
Just make up Oxford University. I was a chaplain there for 2 years, and then a chaplain of Jesus College, Oxford, for 3 years. But by that time, the Lewis estate had grown so much, and there was such a demand for Lewis's writings that the estate asked if I would resign all of that and devote most of my time to the Lewis editing. So after that, I really have never been parish priest, as so many are. Yeah. I mean, I've only been just an honorary curate, but who's really working most of the time on C.S. Lewis's writings.
We had discussed earlier a theme for our
Yes.
program besides your own journey in,
Yes.
and we thought the issue of authority was such an important one. Looking back on your whole journey there in the United States, where you were born, and then teaching there, and then being brought into the ministry, how did you understand authority as an Anglican?
Well, I thought at that time that, that perhaps the Archbishop of Canterbury had more authority than he actually does. We see in the Lambeth conferences that though, he can call, a solemn assembly and who can initiate some things, he doesn't have the final authority over any other bishop, though. And I think I overestimated that, but I think it was simply easy to overestimate it at that time. But then at that time, in the 60s, people were still speaking with more of a single voice in the Anglican Church than they do today. But within a few years, though, I realized that it was a matter of many voices. And what I simply couldn't understand is how something one could regard, say, the belief that Christ rose from the dead is true, and others say it's not true. I simply cannot think that way. Like Lewis, I believe in objective truth. Now, what converted Lewis, through Tolkien's help in 1931, was believing in real things of resurrection, crucifixion, incarnation, real things. Not our thoughts about them, but real things. What happened to the real things? It seemed to me that they were being bargained away. And then when the Church of England set up its General Synod, where you simply had people voting on truth, I began to...
And it wasn't just bishops.
No, it was everybody. See, the General Synod is made up of laity, the priests, and the bishops, all of whom vote. So in the ordination of women, this issue was before the church, as it was for so many years. I began to feel that the church was losing sight of Christ. Where was truth in all of this? And I really didn't want to spend the rest of my life, next 20, 30, 40 years, simply debating what I thought was essentially a political issue. Not what truth was, but what people voted for, what the world wanted. If the Archbishop of Canterbury said in 1992, how can we hold up our heads if we disappoint the world, And I thought, we're doing things for people who don't even believe in Christ. I don't say that he saw it that way, but anyway, I was losing sight of Christ. And I thought, who is in charge? And anyway, I thought, I've heard of women who say, you made an honest woman of me. And I thought, who will make an honest man of me? And so my eyes began to turn to the only one who I thought was a legitimate authority, the Pope.
That statement by that, who made that statement again? Well, we don't want to disappoint the world. Who was that you said?
The Archbishop of Canterbury.
That's such a sad statement, because when you think about what Christ told us about not trying to please the world, that if the world hated him, it's going to hate us, and we take a stand. And what's particularly sad about that is that when you look at, here we sit outside of Oxford, and we think about the men and women who gave their faith in defense of their Catholic background, and not pleasing the world, which was a part of what was going on. That is I'm hoping that he was a little bit blind when he said that to those bigger implications.
Well, I think his exact words were, "What will the world think of us if we don't ordain women?" And so at that time, I had just been talking to a number of unbelievers who didn't believe that priests existed, but who believed that priestesses should exist. So in a way, I thought, this is very, very sad for England, where even I would have welcomed a talk about sin at that time. You know, I miss, the ancient verities. Let's talk about sin, heaven, hell, the four last things, but not everlasting, this one question of women's rights. And I didn't think it was a matter of rights anyway, but a matter of truth. And so I began thinking, and it was at that time that I had very fortunate for me, I had an audience with Pope John Paul II.
Well, talk about that, because that's fascinating.
Well,
how did that come about?
Well, I had wanted very, very much to meet him. And when he was here in 1982, people would have laughed at me. I had all the papers out on the floor trying to map where he was and where he was going. And I didn't see how I could be within 500 yards of where the Pope was. Anyway, so I didn't get to meet him or even see him. But right after that, I knew that he liked C.S. Lewis's writings because he had mentioned the Four Loves in 1978, right after he became Pope. And one of his friends from Krakow told me that he was always talking about Lewis. Anyway, in 1984, a priest in Rome wrote to ask if I would come and visit the Pope. As he put it, would you be willing to come and have a chat with the Pope? Well, I really didn't think this could be true. So I didn't really answer the question. And later, I realized he really meant it. And he says, I know you're busy, but he's busy too. Couldn't you spare 5 minutes? And I rang up to Rome and I said, I'm so sorry. Of course I'll come at any time. Anyway, I went that November, and I was terrified, absolutely terrified. And once I got there, I wasn't sure that I really wanted to go through with this. Of course, you have to. And I began worried then that I'd be poisoned by the Italian water, so I would even brush my teeth with all this bottled water. Anyway, when I finally saw him at the end of the Wednesday audience, it was like meeting Aslan, this great man, silently walked in. There he was. And he began with the most pastoral question put to me about Lewis ever by anybody. He said, do you still love your old friend C.S. Lewis? And I said, oh yes, Holy Father, both friendship and affection. He said, you knew I liked the Four Loves. And I said, Holy Father, I think you forgot that you made it clear that you liked it. So he wanted to know what Lewis was, what he was like. I can see from his point of view, it was sort of like me and Dr. Jones. I wanted to find out what he was like. But at the end of our discussion about Lewis, I hoped he would say something, but I thought it would be impertinent of me to ask what he thought. But anyway, at the end, he said, C.S. Lewis knew what his apostolate was. And they didn't say anything more, and I thought he'd ended. Then he added, and he did it. And I realized you got both sides of what the Holy Father likes. You know what your apostolate is, but you might not do it. But Lewis did it. It was wonderful. It's the best thing said about Lewis. The two sides meet together to form the whole man.
Now, before we move on, we may have a couple of viewers wondering, the Holy Father was like Aslan? You and I know we're talking about. You better explain to our audience who's Aslan.
Aslan is Lewis's character in the 7 Chronicles of Narnia. Lewis asks the question, it's not allegories, he says, but a supposition. What would the Son of God be like if he became a lion in Narnia, just as he became a man in this world? So you're not saying Jesus moves from the world to Narnia, but what would the Son of God be like if he became a character in Narnia? Well, this is wonderful lion that you feel, well, you know is Christ. This is the one we know is Christ. And he's so compelling that it makes you love Christ more than you think you could otherwise. Anyway,
There's that statement about I wish I could remember quite about. He's not quite a tame lion, or I forgot the description. Because there's this mixture of the gentleness and the love of Aslan, but the fear.
Yeah, the fear of Aslan too. He is fearful. He is to be. He is wholly desirable, but fearful. And I felt this with the Pope. I felt too that the care of the churches, how St. Paul's words came to my mind, the care of the churches pressing upon this man. And I thought, in one way, he has the saddest job in the world, didn't he? The care of the churches, everybody in the world. You know, he cares about them. He prays for all of these people, all of those who the rest of us neglect, or whom unknown except to God.
Now, this visit you had with him was when you were still an Anglican?
Yes, I was still an Anglican, but I thought after meeting him that at least there is the authority. And many of the priests that I met in Italy, who were Italians, simply didn't understand the Anglican system. And they said, but how can all these people be talking about something which is so divisive as the ordination of women? Why doesn't the Archbishop of Canterbury just tell them what the truth is? And I realized, of course, you know, the Catholic Church just doesn't have this problem. You have authority, not everybody his own pope. And so in the end, I thought, what a wonderful witness. You have one tremendous witness for Christ. And then I began to see, of course, Christ would not leave his world without a single authority to settle all of these matters. And I think how odd it would be if Christ says, I love you, I die for you, and now I'm going to leave you without any particular witness, you know, for the next 2,000 years.
Plus, yeah.
I don't think it can happen. I just don't think it could happen. But then I realized I was in a church which didn't teach that.
At least not anymore. You know, I mean,
No, not
in so many
anymore.
ways.
No. And then I think, as I said, you know, the Catholic Church has made an honest man of me. You see, I believe, like Lewis, in purgatory. I believe in prayers for the saints. And I believe in praying for the dead. But I realized I could be called down at any moment by a fellow Anglican or one of the Anglican bishops who would call me heretical. So in one way I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to be in the church where these things are not just merely permitted, but they're the standard fare of the Catholic, you know, standard fare. Anyway, it was beginning to be clear to me that I knew what I ought to do. But then came the question, which I'm sure would be true of many Protestants like myself, is how do you do it? If you love all your fellow Anglicans or Baptists or Presbyterians, how do you do it? And I thought, if the church I'm in does not teach the true faith, and I know one that does, how do I help my fellow Anglicans by remaining in a church which I don't think is ever going to bring them the total satisfaction and lead them to the truth? How do I do it? Well, I know they want me to stay. But then finally it came to what seemed to me to be the biggest question I had to say to myself is, Walter Hoop, I said, I have been trying to save the Anglican Church for 40 years. So now I've run out of steam. I want the Catholic Church to save me. So in one way, I turned over the authority that I just barely held for authority which looked after me. And of course it's complicated, but it was complicated for me. It would be complicated for all of those who watch your program, I know. But in one way, when you just do something, you find the answer to how you'll cope with it then. And I was very grateful when God moved me. Actually, I was in St. Mary Magdalene, actually, celebrating the sacraments when I realized I had to become a Catholic.
That conviction at that point.
And so I stopped I left one church and I walked down the street on the way home and stopped and told Bishop Hollis I wanted to become a Catholic. And he said, if you waited any longer, I would have booted you in. So anyway, of course it was a problem, but in one way, the best thing to do is just do these things. You know?
And trust. And that really, because in our work that we do in the Coming Home Network with Protestant clergy, that often that's what stops them. They get to that point and they just wonder, what am I going to do if I make this jump? And really, you just have to trust that the Lord is going to guide. We're going to take a break, come back in a little bit with more of our discussion. We'll ask you some questions about C.S. Lewis and a number of other issues about what you found in the church when you came home. So we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of The Journey Home that we're filming here in just outside of Oxford. And my guest is Walter Hooper, and you've done a wonderful summary of your journey of faith into the Catholic Church. And I thought there's a couple things to continue on that. And one, if I could backtrack just a little bit, because you mentioned particularly that starting in the mid-60s and on, there was a change within the Anglican Church on how truth was determined. More of a democratic theology after the synod, right? But let's go back a little bit, and many of us converts particularly recognize that up until the 1930s, all the Christian churches were in agreement with the Catholic Church on the use of contraception. And there was a universal acceptance. But it was the Anglicans, particularly at the Lambeth Conference in 1930 or 31, that kind of put the crack in the door, that opened the use of contraception for certain reasons. And of course, once that's opened, now in this day, really it's only the Catholic Church that has stood by that dogma, that teaching. Would you look back to your Anglican days, did you think about that decision by the Anglican Church and its ramifications? And did C.S. Lewis deal with that decision by the Anglican Church?
Lewis thought that because he was a layman and had no position as a pastor, that it didn't behoove upon him to talk about things like that. And in mid-Christianity, he tried to talk about things only which really that Christians held together. But it's clear from the abolition of man that he thinks contraception a very bad thing, because it means that this small group of people will determine who has children, what their children are like, and he even saw genetics, you see. You can even have a designer baby if you haven't killed the baby already. Now, what I felt as an editor and as a biographer of Lewis that I am not permitted to do. I cannot bring something which is not believed by him and pretend that he did believe it. But what I am, I think, entitled to do is to make public what Lewis did believe and said he believed. As in the new version of the biography I wrote with Roger Lansing
Which is just
Green.
being released, right?
It's just being released. In 1964, when his brother was editing some of his C.S. Lewis's letters, he found a letter written to a New York lady. And there are a number of ellipses in the letter, and I didn't know really quite what Lewis's point was. And anyway, this letter has just come to light, and I've just included a quotation of it in the new revised biography. But Lewis asked about abortion. He felt he had to say, and he said that though we must do all within the range of possibility to look after women who are in trouble. We must shelter them, we must get them to the hospital, must be good apostles to those women. We must not kill the baby. We must not commit abortion. And this is the bit that had been left out. Well, I feel as a Catholic that this is a very, very important issue. And so wherever I can, I try to make Lewis's own views as clear as possible. I don't I don't tailor those beliefs to suit me, nor would I tailor those beliefs to suit someone who didn't believe as much as Lewis. Now, the problem for me, partly, in converting to the Catholic Church, was that what would I do to those who, in one way, regarded me as sort of like I regarded Bob Jones Jr. when I met him, someone just with this connection to Lewis. Would I be leading them astray? And in a way, I reasoned mainly two things. First of all, the Protestant Church seems to me, I know I've been there, and I've been certainly, this has been my experience. We follow leaders. We like Pastor Jones, and we think, I'll stay in the church with Pastor Jones as I trust him. He leaves, and we find somebody else that we like, and we depend on this particular human source. Anyway, I realized you couldn't do that. You can't lay upon anybody this responsibility to just hold me up all this time. But then point number two is, I really believe in mere Christianity. I don't believe it's enough. And Lewis didn't think it was enough, but it's a lot. It's the core beliefs of all Christians, Protestant and Catholics. By 1988, when I converted, I really, if you said, where is mere Christianity? If, say, St. Athanasius came back today and said, where can I find mere Christianity? I honestly couldn't say that you would find it in many Anglican churches. The only church I could point to as actually having it is the Catholic Church. So you could say, I kept on following mere Christianity till it led me to the place where it is standard fare.
Reflect a bit on C.S. Lewis's, with Mere Christianity, his view of, as an Anglican, you still have an Episcopal structure, but yet we're surrounded, even in here in England, with the evangelicals, the independent churches. How did C.S. Lewis feel about this idea of an independent church without any connection to any other churches other than the faith in Christ?
I think he would have been appalled at seeing the tensions and the fractures, and he worried in 1948 when he heard of the ordination of two women in Hong Kong. He wrote to his friend Darth L. Sayers and said, you know, nothing could be more divisive than this issue. We mustn't allow this to happen. He said, can you imagine what the relationship between the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church would be? We'd be split asunder even more than now. She didn't feel able to take it on, but Lewis took it on himself, and he produced an essay which I wouldn't have been surprised if Cardinal Ratzinger had written the very same words, you know, because it is very much like the documents which came from his department in 1976, and which are repeated by the Pope. Anyway, Lewis was an Anglican who believed what he actually wrote. These things, some things were non-negotiable. The resurrection was non-negotiable. Priesthood was non-negotiable. Contraception, non-negotiable. We have to believe these things, you know. Otherwise, why call yourself a Christian? Anyway, so in one way, I am really an example of what your program is called. I came home.
If you were to have quoted to C.S. Lewis that text from 2 Timothy, the pillar and foundation of truth is the church, how would he have understood the church? Would he have just said the Anglican Church? Would he have seen the invisible church?
Well, he would have meant, I think, well, of course, both. Like Cardinal Newman says, I mean, you know, the small little churches is part of the church. But no, he meant universal church. And I think Lewis himself believed that he was simply a Christian. I think if the Church of England, for some reason, say, disappeared, I don't think his beliefs would have been in ruins by any means, you know, because he really looked for those witnesses who still believe these things. Anyway, when I came into the church in 1988 and I went to my first Mass in Oxford, St. Aloysius, where Cardinal Newman had preached, I couldn't believe the difference. After my head had been filled with years and years of politics over the ordination of women, here were these priests talking about God, here talking about sin, about heaven and hell, and I thought, I haven't heard this talk in years and years, you know, and it's gone on ever since. I think I've never really been such an agile man that I could jump up and click my heels, but if I could do it, I would do it 3 or 4 times a day, simply the sheer pleasure of being a Catholic.
Here we are in this wonderful place where Newman made his final decision, and not far down the corridor he was received into the church. What place did Newman's writings have in your own journey?
Oh, tremendous. His Apologia, Pro Vita Sua, was very important, but I think one of the most important books in my conversion, really, is his essay on the development of Christian doctrine. Newman believed, in effect, that the truth is given all entire to the disciples, to the apostles. This is the revelation. But it takes, as you'd say today, a long time to unpack it. And so it takes many minds over many centuries before we come to the fullness of understanding of it. For instance, the doctrine of hell really wasn't understood finally until about the 4th century. It was not until the early centuries you see that we have a total doctrine of the 2 natures of Christ, the nature of Our Lady. These things take a long time, and Newman said, in effect, that if you took all of these great doctrines that we now have in the Catholic Church, and you took them to the apostles and said, is this what you meant? They would have said, yes, that's what we meant. And so I thought, this explains why the Catholic Church doesn't have numerous doctrines. It has a few clear doctrines which are developed, and it is totally consistent within itself. Remember my first Sunday as a Catholic, and I thought, it all holds together. It all holds together. And in one way, it's as simple as a tulip, you know, just clear, it's there.
I know that a large percent of our audience have read C.S. Lewis or are interested in reading C.S. Lewis. How about reflecting on a couple more of the books? You've mentioned Mere Christianity. How about his wonderful book that you said the Holy Father liked, Four Loves? Talk a bit about what that book was about, and now from a Catholic, give you a bit of a review of that book.
Well, so I think that the Holy Father, had been developing his theology of the human body ever since he was a bishop in Poland. Now, what I think he liked about the Four Loves was Lewis said, you know, when we talk about love, we mean more than just, say, a young man's love for this pretty girl, or the pretty girl's admiration for of this boy. No, we're talking about 4 different things. The 4 loves are affection, friendship, eros, which is what we usually mean by love, and charity, which is God loves for us and our love for God. But what Lewis says is these things, they often come to us in mixtures, like you probably have affection for your dog, but you love your wife, both friendship, I hope, and eros. But none of these loves, see, this is what the Holy Father likes, none of these loves, the 3 first loves, is enough in itself. Each one can become tyrannical, and to rein them in, they must all be sweetened by charity. If Christ is not in charge, any of these loves can lead to despair and badness as well as goodness. So I think what he saw is Lewis had really developed the these four loves and give them each that structure. Each has a part to play in all of our lives, but they must all be controlled by charity.
We've just finished a century where it seems that one of the main ways the devil attacked us is making all of our relationships suspect. Things have changed so much. Man with man, man with woman, woman with woman, adult with child, priest with child. And it seems like we've lost the purity of the friendship that C.S. Lewis talks about in The Four Loves. And a couple things. I'm wondering, did C.S. Lewis anticipate what happened by the end of the 20th century? And what about his book for us? Can we ever get back to what he's calling us to get to in The Four Loves?
Well, I think what Lewis did, I think he was far ahead of his time. Very, very far ahead of him. And the last thing he wrote for Americans. It was in the Saturday Evening Post, and it was called "We Have No," quote, "right to happiness." And he points out in the American Declaration of Independence, talk about the right to happiness by every lawful means. Anyway, Lewis's point is that you might move not merely from the right to happiness or anything by lawful means, but just the mere right to happiness, which is what many people want. So a right to marry anybody you like, or like the right to sleep with anybody you like. We don't actually have these rights, but we're fighting for carte blanche. And in one way, if you get all of these things, you destroy your society, I think, itself. And the Church of England, sadly, terribly, terribly sadly, it now listens to simply everyone who is unhappy about something. Say the homosexual wants to be able to marry another homosexual. And the Church of England will say, well, who are we to deny them this? The Catholic Church has to be sometimes the only lone voice in the world saying, no. We're sorry for you. We'll do everything we can to help you. You're broken and you need healing. But we won't say something is true just to suit you.
In fact, that's what the Holy Father essentially says is the opposite. Who am I to change what is true? And that's the honesty of his position that he recognizes in Christ. Another book that I particularly like of C.S. Lewis's books was The Great Divorce. Could you tell what that book's about? Because it's not about a divorce in essence, but it's a wonderful book. And then if you could critique that a bit as a Catholic.
Yes, this is, I think, is one of the most valuable books that Lewis wrote. It will always be valuable. It can't ever be dated by any means. What Lewis does in this is to imagine what it would be like if a group of people from hell were allowed to have an excursion, a holiday, in the sort of the purlieus of heaven. He got the idea from the Catholic idea of the refugerium, which goes back many, many centuries to the idea of a holiday from hell in heaven. Anyway, so Lewis takes this idea, which Tolkien was very interested in too, and this book was read by chapter to the other inklings as it was being written. Anyway, Lewis puts himself amongst those who go from hell to heaven, and they're met by friends they've known in this world who are now in heaven. And the people from heaven have been sent down there to join these people and to urge them to stay and to be with them. So let's say you are given a chance. Anyway, Lewis, there's this wonderful conversation between those people, and mainly what you see is that hell is what you choose. It's not something you're sent to. And as Lewis ends by saying, or having somebody say, to those in one way who choose heaven, the world will always seem to be part of heaven. But to those who reject heaven, then the world will all have seen, they will have always said, I was always in hell. Anyway, Lewis believed in purgatory, and this is in one way his best work on purgatory.
Purgatory, yes.
But this was, you see, one of the themes which I can see why, but many of his Protestant admirers prefer to keep very, very quiet. But Lewis himself couldn't keep quiet about it. And in his last book, Letters to Malcolm, he brings it up. And he says the reformers sometimes got it wrong about purgatory, but Cardinal Newman got it exactly right in his Dream of Gerontius, where when the saved soul is taken up to heaven, before he meets God, he says, no, I would rather be cleansed first. And so he's taken to purgatory to be cleansed. And Lewis says, our souls demand purgatory. He said, if, you could go up to God just as you are, and God says, we're not careful here. We don't care what you look like. Wear anything you like. When the saved soul says, even so, sir, I'd rather be cleansed first. And so Lewis says, my favorite analogy of this comes from the dentist chair. After the tooth of life is drawn, the dentist will hand you a cup of something and he'll say, rinse your mouth out with this. This is purgatory. It's the only thing will make you well. And so Lewis himself hoped that he would go to purgatory and be cleansed first.
Two of the other images from that book, which I've always loved, is one, when they arrive in heaven, their weight doesn't even depress the grass, which describes the difference in quality and beauty between heaven, which is so different than we can imagine than hell. But also this, they find this woman who is this woman that has all these people acclaiming her glory, and it was a simple woman that gave out of her charity. And she is the greatest in heaven. And it was a wonderful image. One last thing, Walter, as we draw to a close. I think it was the last book of the Narnia Tales, which is a wonderful series for children. I think it was the last book. There's this, it was the statement by the mouse. What was that?
Reepicheep.
By Reepicheep. It was just my favorite character of when he makes a statement higher up and deeper in. Higher up and deeper in. If you would, what did C.S. Lewis mean by that? And does that describe your journey finally into the Catholic Church?
Yes, it does. So what Lewis meant was that, it's not just all a matter of morality. Morality, as he said, are just sort of the hooks and grapple that we use to climb up to the heights, like Reepicheep did. But after that, you go on beyond that. And what I found that surprised me to death, but in one way Lewis prepared me for this, was that what the Catholic Church is about is not personal empowerment. That's politics. What it's about are not popes, not archbishops. No, it's about holiness. And this is one of the thrust of the Second Vatican Council is the universal holiness of all of its members. So if you said, who is important to Catholics? It would be Mother Teresa and simple people like that who got on with God's work and who would just, that's what we celebrate. Well, all these 300,000 people were in St. Peter's Square just a month ago. They were celebrating the holiness of Jose Maria Escrivá.
Yeah, that's right. Who calls us in his emphasis theology that we are to seek our holiness where we're at, even if we're in the most simple of life. And C.S. Lewis, in many of his writings, was pointing out to many evangelicals who don't quite always get the call to holiness, but he was calling them to that, wasn't he?
Yes, he was. I feel in one way, not only am I following mere Christianity, because mere Christianity is really about how to become holy. And I found it doesn't mean that I'm a good man myself, I know that, and I know the Catholic Church has heretics in it, but it itself is not heretical. And God gave it to us, and if I want to go deeper and upwards, I think it's the only place I can go and be at home.
Deeper and upwards. That's such a wonderful phrase to meditate on the meaning of that. John the Baptist said, he must increase, I must decrease. And that process
Yes.
is what draws us higher
Yes.
and deeper into Christ.
Yes.
Walter, thank you very much for joining us on the journey
My
home.
pleasure.
It is a great
Yes,
pleasure to
yes.
meet with you, and thank you for your work with bringing C.S. Lewis even more to us now through the continued editing of his
Yes.
letters and your new book on his biography, which I want to remind the audience that when I leave this table, Doug Keck will join Walter Hooper
Yes.
and do a bookmark where he'll be talking with Walter about his new updated biography of C.S. Lewis. So you'll want to look forward to that here on EWTN. Thank you for joining us. Look forward to being with you on another special episode of